On this video, Garphill Games graces us with another one in its West Kingdom trilogy, Viscounts of the West Kingdom. You've heard me holler about Raiders of the North Sea and Architects of the West Kingdom, and I've even mentioned Paladins as well. The question is this one any good? And for me, where does it feature in the trilogy? Stay tuned to find out. Hello, I'm Luke Hector from the Broken Meeple, and if this is your first time checking out my channel, then be sure to check out other videos I've done where I talk about top 10s, reviews, solo plays, random vlogs, you name it, I've done it. If it takes your fancy and you find it entertaining or useful in any regard, please consider subscribing, I'd certainly appreciate it. And if the game I'm talking about today takes your fancy, regardless of my verdict, then consider acquiring it from zatu.co.uk in the UK, where you can use my code at the bottom of the screen and in the description to get 5% off your entire basket of games. Is there a gap in your collection? Then consider filling it up today. Viscounts is the third game in the West Kingdom trilogy, which started off with Architects and then went on with Paladins. Now we got Viscounts. This is a point salad Euro game where via several actions you are essentially moving your Viscount around a rondel map system in order to perform various actions and score points in different ways. The theme is somewhat laid to the wayside here. It's mainly about 4 very key different mechanics coming together and allowing you to score points. These actions and the way that you ultimately score points derive from a deck building mechanic as well as a tableau system in front of you. You have a collection of townsfolk in a small deck to begin with, but you can hire additional townsfolk around the board as the game progresses, as well as trash cards from your deck depending on what actions you perform. The idea is that when you play these cards, you are laying them out on a tableau of 3 cards in front of you. These will determine which characters for you are in play, and you're interested in 2 main aspects. Firstly, the abilities at the bottom of the card. These will be abilities that kind of go off when they get discarded from your tableau or when you put them into play, or maybe a continuous ability. But the second thing that you're interested in are the icons on the top left. The monetary value represents how far you can move with your Viscount, but the other icons determine the power of the various actions that you can take. These actions, which rely on specific icons, include trading, where you convert money bags into different resources, buildings, where you convert hammers into buildings for points and other abilities, workers, which use a kind of squire crest symbol, where you're placing workers in this central castle, which I can only describe as a kind of weird pinball multi-ball mechanic, where by placing the workers around the outside of the castle, they eventually trigger when they get too great in number, move up the castle, and you're trying to control it for points and other abilities in a kind of King of the Hill fashion. And then on top of that, you have the fourth action, transcribing manuscripts, which converts cross symbols into taking these tiles that are situated around the board for instant bonuses, potential endgame scoring opportunities, but mainly to get the different 4 colours of manuscripts in order to collect set bonuses. On top of all this, you've also got deed and debt cards. Deed red, debt black. The idea being that you will collect these cards as the game goes on, and you'll be able to flip these for extra bonuses. Getting a deed card is worth a victory point, but flip it, it's worth 3. Getting a debt is 2 negative points, but if you flip it, you lose the negative points and get a resource. The reason these 2 exist though is because you have an endgame timer which is based on these 2 decks running out. If one of those decks runs out, then the other one scores at the end, but then the endgame is triggered. There is even more besides, including a virtue mechanic where 2 markers on your board move together, collide, and then eventually trigger off another effect. You can dismiss townsfolk for a one-off bonus. There's quite a lot going on in this game in terms of options, way more than any overview can do in the time we've got, so maybe I'll cover the important parts a little bit later. But just get the idea that you are performing actions based off the icons on townsfolk on a rondel map system as you move around, and of course, once the game end is triggered, have a guess what happens to the person who has the most points.
Of course!
So let's get into some details and hopefully not take 30 minutes in doing so, starting with duration. How long does the game take to play? This depends heavily on the player count. The game is quoting to take about 90 minutes to play, maybe about 2 hours tops. That's what a typical length game of this is, about 90 minutes to 2 hours, but slight caveat with that. If you're playing solo, you could probably get this done in less time, but if you're playing this with 4 players, I feel that 2 hour mark is You should be able to do it, but it depends on the players. The AP potential of this game is quite high, and to be honest, there's not a huge amount of difference by adding more players other than just a little bit of extra contention around the board. I'm not certain I want to play this that often with a full count of 4 players because I just think the length can potentially go on to quite a high level, not to mention the downtime between turns, because once you've planned out what you're going to do, there's only so much that the opponents will end up doing that will change your mind on this fact. Yeah, you better have a backup plan because there is the occasional thing that might go wrong, but for the most part, if you've got your move sorted, you're kind of just waiting for your turn to come back round. In a 2-player, the turns are pretty snappy. In a 3-player, it's not too bad. With 4, it just crosses that line, I think, for taking just a wee bit too long. But in a solo game, it's very fast. Of course, it's just you and a very simple AI to control. But if we're going to forget that AP is a thing, then you are essentially talking about 60 minutes for your solo game, 90 minutes around for your 2-player, maybe your 3-player if you're playing at a good speed, and 2 hours tops hopefully for your 4-player game. E for ease of play. Is the game easy to grok? Is it a bit too complex for some? Well, it kind of depends on how used you are to the West Kingdom trilogy. Chances are you are not going into this game having not tried Architects or Paladins. And if that's the case, then fine, you've got iconography that is fairly familiar to you, but there's still quite a lot of unique stuff in here. And there's a fair amount of iconography, it has to be said, in this game. But if you are brand new to this trilogy, then there's going to be a lot to absorb, not just in rules, but also the crazy amount of iconography. Some of it you'll be able to figure out, but there's some of it that you will not be able to figure out. So you're going to need a pretty good teacher to get you through your first game, and certainly I think for most people, the first game is going to be a bit of a learning experience. The rulebook itself is quite text heavy, but there is a fair amount of pictorial examples in here. But I do find that there are certain rules in here that were a bit ambiguous, particularly with regards to the castle. The castle is easily the fiddliest thing in this book to explain, especially when multiple events can trigger, because essentially you put workers on the castle ramparts, and when 3 of your colour are in the same section, then 1 goes up to trigger an ability, the other 2 go to the side, which could then trigger another set of 3 meeples, which rinse repeat. The meeple could then come back on itself and somehow trigger another event, depending on how many meeples were there in the first place. It's, like I say, a pinball multi-ball style mechanic, as I called it. That one has some FAQ moments, which I must admit aren't explained as well as I would like in the book. Even the solo rules tend to be a little bit vague in areas, and I just kind of get the impression that this one is a little bit more FAQ ridden than the previous ones in this series, even Paladins to that extent. Not to say that it's hard to learn or like, you know, the rulebook's diabolical or anything like that, but there's a bit more of a curve with this one compared to the others, even though I would probably put this somewhere in the middle of the trilogy in terms of its complexity, but not too much further below Paladins. This is easily like a couple of steps above Architects in terms of its complexity, but I would say Paladins has got a little bit more on its plate in order to do, but this one I think just makes life a little bit harder with regards to the rulebook and all the iconography. T for tactics and strategy. This is where this game scores high marks indeed. Wow. If you like having a lot of options on your turn, this game is for you. I love deck building in general, and I admit, I say a lot that I don't like it when deck building is shoehorned in as a side mechanic. This one, I wouldn't say is shoehorned in. It's still the focus point of the game, and even then, we're not talking full-on deck building here. You only have about 10 townsfolk, I think, to begin with. You know, certainly not many, and you tend to trash them pretty quickly, as well as acquire a few additional ones, and even then you only have a hand size of 3, and there's only 3 townsfolk out at any particular time. It's not really deck building per se, it's more how you arrange the 3 townsfolk on your board that's more important. If somebody else lands on your space, you can rearrange them, and you might be thinking, well, if that one falls off the edge, I get that ability. I'd quite like that sooner. Okay, we'll put it over there. But then you might want to keep a perpetual ability on your board for a bit longer. So you'll be like, well, okay, can I move them back then? And of course, all your actions are powered by the icons on the cards. So you've got a lot of decisions to make about, well, I'd like to put this person down because he's got 2 money bag icons. I could do a big trade, but then the ability's done and it's kind of useless after that point. But it also has a movement value of 3. I do need to get across the board quite a way. I don't want to spend the silver to do it. Ooh, but I don't know, maybe this card would do. But but it's a criminal. That means I get corruption. There's a lot of choices from just the cards alone. Then you get into which 4 actions you're going to do in the turn. These allow for way different paths to victory compared to a lot of other games I've played. If you're playing a strategy focused around building, it feels like your game is very different to playing, say, the castle workers or the manuscript tiles. Yes, it's essentially a point salad at the end of the day, and theme-wise there's pretty much no theme there. I mean, come on, castle pinball mechanic, does anybody think that's thematic in any way? But it's just great to have a different style. When I first played this with 2 friends of mine, I went full on castle. I just went full on, populated it with a ton of meeples, and I felt like I was doing something really different to a friend of mine who decided to try and empty their board of buildings. The next game I decided to change things up a bit and went for the manuscripts, and it's like, the characters I'm using are different, the abilities are a bit different, but even just how I'm playing the game and what I'm prioritizing felt different. Each time I play this game, I feel like I can try something new and not exhaust myself until probably a good 6 or 7 games in. And even then, this can be influenced by your starting characters because you can choose different setup cards and different special characters to put in your deck at the start of the game. I love that. Love it when a game does that. But then you might also have, well, you know what, I found this townsfolk during the game. That gives me that cool ability, so maybe I'll do something with that. Because you've got 5 decks of those townsfolk, you go through them pretty quickly, so you're going to see quite a lot of townsfolk in each game, and you just might happen to spot one going, oh, it looks interesting. Maybe I'd quite like him. Maybe I'd quite like to get that in my deck. There's just a lot of different options to play around with, and it makes for a really interesting game, both tactically and strategically. Player interaction is not the highest ever with this one, but there's plenty of ways for someone to block your building space, get in your way and kick your workers off the castle, nick that manuscript tile that you're doing, land on your space so that you get to rearrange your board. You've also got to look at those virtue and corruption markers, because if they trigger, then whoever triggered it gets the more beneficial ability at the top. Well, potentially, it depends whether they're more corrupt or more virtuous, but then everybody else gets the bit at the bottom, which tends to be a bit problematic, particularly if you're going criminal heavy. But criminals are wild icons. Maybe you want them, who knows? So there's definitely a case of, as much as I say 4 players is probably going a little bit too far, there is an incentive to play with a second and third player, and you do have to pay attention to what they're doing. Okay, I can't necessarily stop you doing the building strategy, but certainly when I'm looking at your board and thinking, well, you've got a bunch of cards there that, oh, wait a minute, you want that character to fall off the end. I better not land on your space because then you'll get to rearrange. That could be a bad thing. And also the deed and debt cards, the endgame timer, where you have to keep an eye on those packs, because if the red ones run out, the black ones score for first, second, and place for how many you flipped. And vice versa. If the blacks run out, the red ones score. So you're looking at what other players have got, how many they flipped, how likely is it that the red pile or the black pile is going to run out. Maybe you'll try and accelerate one. Maybe you'll try and prepare for, like, oh, they're getting a lot of red cards. Maybe I should actually get some debts and flip them. That's another 12 points potentially at the end. So many options, so many things to consider, hence the potential for AP, but it makes for a very rich, fulfilling experience. A for aesthetics. Is the game well produced? Does it look nice and colourful? Well, if you've played Paladins or Architects, you know what the art style is going to be like, and if you like that art style like I do, then you're going to get the same amount here, so you won't have a problem with that. It looks identical to the rest, so even the townsfolk, you'll recognise their pictures from other games. In terms of the components, well, I mean, you've got some, you know, not the most sturdiest of player boards, but things don't slide around on them constantly, and it's mainly a reference guide than anything else, so that's not a problem. But on top of that, you got lots of wooden pieces for gold and stone and ink wells, you know, not just cubes. Standard cardboard coins, but you can upgrade it to metal coins, but again, I would have liked them to be in the game, but like I say, you can only have so much. You get this weird little castle thing that goes in the middle with tiles that fall out like that, but they're just in there to show what abilities the thing does. There's a bucket load of cars. There's a lot of components squished into this little box, and yeah, if they release an expansion for this, I can tell we're going to have the exact same problem with these games, that the box is not big enough. It's just about right at the moment, and I have yet to sleeve my cards, which I do recommend you do actually. The card quality is the same as it was before. Feels nice, kind of linen finish, but not the sturdiest of cardboard either. I tend to sleeve my games with this. I recommend you sleeve at least the big cards in here, the townsfolk ones. Don't worry too much about the debts and deeds, they're pretty generic and they're not handled as much, but the townsfolk, yeah, I recommend getting some sleeves. But all in all, overall, it's a well-packaged product. I for Immersion. Is the theme immersive, and are you involved on all turns, engaged with the game? Well, half and half. Certainly you are engaged throughout, because even though there might be a little bit of downtime between players on a 4-player game, there's a lot to think about on your turn and even off it. You've got your hand of free cards. Well, which character should I play? You should be thinking about that while it's other people's turns, and it's harder to make that decision than you might think. You've got all the different options. Am I going to go trade? Am I going to go build? All that stuff will keep your mind focused. Theme-wise though, the game doesn't have any theme. I mean, the game kind of, you knew that going in when you do. I mean, the theme in Architects was only semi there. Paladins, it was completely non-existent. This one is also completely non-existent. If not, well, hard to say. Is it the same level as Paladins? Maybe a little bit below it, but either way, you're not going into this for the theme. I mean, you've got deck building, a rondel mechanic, dismissing townsfolk, you've got, a castle pinball mechanic or whatever. It's like, yeah, come on. What theme is that castle trying to represent? This is not something you're playing to be immersed in what you're doing theme-wise. You are heavily immersed though from the mechanical perspective, which is one of the reasons I really do enjoy this game. I know going in it's not a thematic game, but this is one of those occasions where I don't particularly care.
I don't think any of us expected him to say that.
Even if it was pretty thematic, it would have been a pretty boring setting anyway. L for longevity, would the game have a decent amount of replay value? Is there other options of how to play? Yep, this game definitely gives you a decent amount of value. Firstly, as I've already mentioned several times, the amount of different paths to victory that you have is already good reason. You've got multiple different characters that you could get for your deck, and yes, it's just one character card, but they're pretty distinct. They're very different from each other and could lend to different strategies. On top of that, you've got the setup cards. Essentially a bit like, say, Teotihuacan and a few other games, where you get to draft a column of cards at the start, and one of them is telling you what coins and resources and deed and debts and stuff you get at the start, maybe even a free building, who knows. But they're very different, and I love games that give you that variable setup. You might decide, well, I'm going to go for the manuscript strategy this time. I've got this character and this setup. You could play that same strategy with a different character and a different setup, and it could certainly influence your early game, if nothing else, in a different fashion to what there was before. Not to mention you've got 5 decks of townsfolk to pick from, of which they're going to be in different orders each game. Some will get dismissed, some will get hired, so you've got a lot of variety. I dare say more than Architects, and probably as much, if not more meaningful than Paladins even. And that's before you even get to the solo mode. And I've gotta say, I did not expect this. Paladins of the West Kingdom, I kind of got bored with eventually. I liked it at first, I gave it an 8 out of 10, but I very quickly found it to get very repetitive. It didn't really have the replay value for me. You pretty much had 3 paths to victory, and it all felt the same, all the actions felt the same, and I just quickly got bored. It's probably down to about a 6 out of 10 for me. Architects is still a 10 out of 10. It is high up in my charts. Play it multiplayer usually, but the solo mode in this is pretty decent. The solo mode in Viscounts, though, is fantastic.
This is why Superman works alone.
It is brilliant. You've got 4 different ways that the AI can do their actions. They might favor certain strategies, but it's so simple. When you know how to play the multiplayer game, doing the solo mode, it requires a little bit of learning for how their actions work, but for the most part, you have the reference card in front of you that basically says if they would gain this particular action via this icon, it just converts into this. And so there may be like 3 or 4 icons that are different from the multiplayer game that all derive to give them a virtue. So once you've got that sorted, the rest of the operation of it is straightforward. You basically flip a card off a deck, you've got the same 3 card tableau, it counts up its icons, and you go from top to bottom in order of moving the Viscount and deciding what action it does. If it's got enough icons to build, it will build, for example. But if it doesn't, it will get a deed. And if there's no deeds, it will get a debt. Whatever. It gives you the entire sequence laid out, and the different boards have different focuses. So one board will require you to take out certain cards in order that most of the time it will try to build. Another one will try to do the castle. Another one is obsessed with flipping cards. So you get a different feel for these different AI opponents that in themselves aren't any different from a difficulty perspective, but they will play differently. But it's so smooth. You just basically go flip, done. Right, my turn. Done. flip, done. It's very quick and easy, but it's challenging. I mean, this is not an easy one, and unfortunately there's not really any way you can tweak the difficulty without house ruling the game, unfortunately, but it's challenging. I mean, I won my first game, but I sort of got quite lucky with what I was doing, and it turned out I played a rule wrong, which meant that I only won by a gnat's wing at the end. But then I played it again and again, and those other 2 times I got my rear end handed to me by the AI, so it definitely will, like, it will punch you around, and it's basically a case of more of a race. You can't really stop the AI doing what it needs to do. You need to get your stuff done quicker and end the game in a position where you feel stronger than they are. If you let them go on too long, they'll wipe the floor with you. So it is a bit of a race against time, but it's just such a good solo mode. I've enjoyed this solo mode probably more so than the multiplayer section, which I know I say about a lot of games, but it's not to say that this game doesn't work multiplayer. It does, but the solo mode's really good as well. So if you're buying these games for solo play as well, I guarantee you will get a kick out of Viscounts also. So in summary, Viscounts of the West Kingdom, even in its own right, is a fantastic Euro game. It is easily one of the best that Garphill Games has put out to date. It easily eclipses Paladins for me and sits just a little bit below Architects of the West Kingdom because that one is easier to play, quicker to teach, and goes quicker with even up to 6 players than that. This one has its flaws, but they're pretty minor. You know, the ease of play is not that big a deal if you're used to this line of game and the iconography, but even if you aren't used to it, you probably just need one learning game and then you should be pretty comfortable with it. On top of that, the duration with 4 players depends a lot on the AP nature of the players involved. You could get me to play a 4-player of this, but chances are I would go for 3 or 2. But the solo mode, one of the best Eurogame solo modes that's out there. Just all the options, well produced, cool mechanics. This is brilliant. There are some flaws that I have to acknowledge, but these flaws are not enough to drop it from this rating. Yep, that's what I mean. No game is ever perfect, but this game definitely deserves a 10 out of 10 seal of distinction. What? I love it. It is going right there on my shelf above Architects. I will be like, oh, which one do I want to play out of Architects and Viscounts? They're really close. Architects, like I say, gets the slight nudge, but tell me, just pick one. You know, if you want to decide which one to play, I will play either and I will be in my element. Paladins just wasn't my kind of game. It got me going at first, but then just quickly waned for me. Architects is still going strong, particularly with that expansion, and Viscounts is going to go strong for a long time as well. Easily top 100 material, 10 out of 10, not perfect, but easily not got enough flaws in it to put it down to a 9 out of 10 even. I think 9 out of 10 would be the worst I could give it. It would still deserve its seal of distinction. Now, I hope you've been enjoying the content on the Broken Meeple, but I'm not the only creator out there producing videos for your entertainment. And I don't just mean the big channels that everybody talks about on Facebook. They deserve your support, but then so do the smaller creators. Those with barely a few hundred subscribers, maybe a couple of thousand if they're lucky, who are passionate about games, giving solid opinions about games, doing playthroughs, and just want to talk about games, but they're getting missed out and it's not fair. So why don't you check out some smaller channels and support them if you can, starting with this one.
Hello everyone, the boardroom is open and Luke from the Broken Meeple has reached out to all smaller content creators with a call to action. What's the call to action? Share a video like this to promote each other in the board game space. I'm Jeff Anderson with Boardroom Gamer, and I specialize in doing solo play Mondays, some 2-player Tuesdays where I reach out to people across the country, even the world, to join me virtually to play physical board games on my table, as well as a series I call Shelf Talk, where I take a game off my shelf and I talk about it. Why do I like it? Why do I play it? How do you play it? How do you win? And what I think about it. So Luke, thanks so much for this call to action. I really appreciate it, and I hope I see some of you at the next boardroom meeting.
So that's it for me on this episode of the Broken Meeple. If you like what you see and have earned your subscription, then please click the avatar to subscribe, hit the bell for future notifications, and consider supporting other smaller channels. Until next time, check out a recent upload or a video suggested by me, and remember, as always, it's only a game.